we want to be a political home for progressives who really do feel abandoned by corporate Democratic Party.
Hi there, I'm Jesse Mayshak. Welcome to Headlights, Voices from the Progressive South. This is our second episode. If you haven't listened to our first episode, that's where you can find a lot of information about who we are and what we're doing. Headlights is a production of the Progressive South, a nonprofit media platform for, as the name suggests, progressive views and values across the southern United States. Check out our website at theprogressivesouth.org for information about our mission, our board, and how you can contribute if you so choose. We have a lot of things to talk about this week. Coming up, we take our first road trip to Richmond, Virginia, where we talk to Quentin Robbins, a community organizer with a grassroots group called Richmond for All. That was his voice you heard at the top. In our arts and culture segment at the end of the show, we will take a look at a cool festival that happened last week in Durham, North Carolina, organized by the extraordinarily talented singer, songwriter, composer, scholar, banjo player, and all-around cultural juggernaut Rhiannon Giddens. But we will begin with our first weekly news roundup of notable items from around the South. These will vary a lot from week to week, sometimes geographically, sometimes thematically. There'll be news stories that reflect specific issues and circumstances, but that also have some broader resonance, politically or culturally. Or in some cases, they might just be a good yarn. Today we're going to check in on a fight over library books in Arkansas, which seemed to have a happy ending. But there was a twist. Controversy in Louisiana, where Governor Jeff Landry's pick to head the heavily polluted state's Department of Environmental Quality is stirring up a certain kind of storm of her own. And a bill proposed here in my own state of Tennessee that sought to block undocumented children from attending public school. We'll take a look at what happened. So first, let's talk about Arkansas. West Arkansas, specifically, Crawford County. It's on the border with Oklahoma in the southernmost reaches of the Ozarks. The Trail of Tears passed through here, and for a time in the 1800s, it was home to settlements of displaced Cherokees, before they were displaced again further west. Today, Crawford County is home to about 62,000 people, 82% of them white and just 3% Native American. It's a medium-sized, middle-class county with a median household income of about $60,000 and about 13% of the population living in poverty. And for the past few years, the county has been fighting over library books. Back in 2022, two Crawford County residents, Jeffrey and Tammy Hamby, wrote a letter to county officials objecting to books available in the county's public libraries. County governments in Arkansas are called quorum courts, and the county executive is known as the county judge, nomenclature that dates back to medieval England. The Hambys wrote to the quorum court and county judge to specifically raise concerns about books that focused on or mentioned LGBTQ people. They objected, they said, to the agenda that is being pushed by the Van Buren Public Library, aiming education of alternative lifestyles to prepubescent children. In particular, they objected to, quote, progressive woke ideology normalizing and equating homosexual and transsexual lifestyles with heterosexual family units. In other words, what the Hambys didn't like was any suggestion that families with gay or trans people in them were equal to other families. This set off a political fight that ended with the county libraries agreeing to move children's books dealing with specific topics to a new social section in the adult area of the library. The topics covered by the policy included LGBTQ themes, sex education, death, divorce, and, quote, world religions, which presumably means religions other than Christianity. Along the way, the county quorum court named Tammy Hamby, who filed the original complaint, to the county's library board, where she became the chair and helped implement the new policies. But a group of Crawford County parents opposed the segregation of those books and ultimately sued the county on First Amendment grounds. There are some well-established federal court precedents about how governments handle library materials, and one of the guiding principles is that decisions about removing or isolating certain books cannot be based on viewpoint discrimination. That is, books can't be moved or removed just because officials don't like or agree with their points of view. And that is exactly what U.S. District Court Judge P.K. Holmes III found that the Crawford County officials had done. In a ruling handed down last September, which you can read, linked in our show notes, Judge Holmes wrote, "For First Amendment purposes, it is one thing to restrict minors' access to sexually explicit material, but a very different thing to restrict minors' access to unpopular opinions. Here, the undisputed evidence shows that the social section was created not only for the former purpose, but also for the latter, which violates the First Amendment." In addition to Holmes' finding in favor of the parents, a second federal judge, Timothy Brooks, awarded them attorney fees of about $113,000 to be paid by the county. This is a pretty standard award for victorious plaintiffs in civil suits. So there's the happy ending I mentioned earlier. Parents sued to protect children's access to information. The federal courts upheld their First Amendment rights and awarded them the cost of bringing the action. But there is an epilogue to this story. Last week, the Crawford County Library Board, which is now controlled by conservatives recently appointed by the county quorum court, voted to take on the debt of the attorney fees themselves. This was not required by the judicial order, which found the county government overall liable for the fees. It was a voluntary move by the library board to pay the attorneys out of the library's own budget. The library's director, Charlene McDonough, told the online news outlet Arkansas Advocate that the funds will have to come out of next year's library budget, which she said would probably require reducing hours at some branches and purchasing fewer books in the coming year. So effectively, the library board has decided to punish its own patrons for a legal mess entirely created by county officials. Okay, moving on. Let's follow the Mississippi River downstream to Louisiana. You may be aware that Louisiana has long been notorious for its problems with industrial pollution, particularly along an 85-mile stretch of the Mississippi between Baton Rouge and New Orleans that has become known as Cancer Alley for its concentration of petrochemical plants and a long-recognized concentration of cancer risk. According to national rankings compiled by U.S. News & World Report, Louisiana is the second most polluted state in the country. Number one is Indiana, so sympathy to you Hoosiers. So that makes the state environmental agency, known as the Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality, or DEQ, particularly important in protecting local residents. Last year, after the state's new Republican governor, Jeff Landry, took office, he appointed a new head of the DEQ, Aurelia Skipwith Giacometto, an appointee who was interesting for several reasons. She's the first black woman to lead the state agency after having previously served as head of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service during the Trump administration. Her appointment to that federal post had been controversial because of her background. Giacometto was formerly an executive at Monsanto, the agribusiness and biotechnology giant, now owned by Bayer, that has itself had to settle federal pollution lawsuits. She also came under scrutiny for not disclosing her relationship with agribusiness lobbyist Leo Giacometto, whom she married in 2021. He died suddenly the following year. As head of the Fish and Wildlife Service, Aurelia Giacometto was criticized by environmental groups for refusing to add monarch butterflies to the federal endangered species list, for relaxing rules against the killing of birds by oil and gas companies, and for opening 3 million acres of forested land in the Pacific Northwest to timber companies, which had previously been protected as habitat for the threatened northern spotted owl. So how are things going a little more than a year into Giacometto's tenure protecting environmental quality in Louisiana? Well, it's been a little rocky. Last week saw the latest high-profile departure from the agency when its senior finance official, Teresa Della Fosse, quit after 9 years at DEQ. She did not make any public statements about her departure, but it came in the wake of mounting criticism of Giacometto's leadership from both within and outside the department. DEQ's long-serving ombudsman, Roger Ward, quit 2 weeks before Della Fosse after 32 years associated with the agency. On his way out, he sent a 7-page letter detailing serious concerns with the department's director. We will link it in the show notes. It is worth reading in its entirety. But to give you an idea of its tone, Ward wrote that, quote, "The increasingly erratic and alarmingly vicious behavior that the current LDEQ secretary exhibits toward agency personnel has caused me to realize that I cannot and will not continue to work in the toxic and hostile workforce that LDEQ has become under the so-called leadership of Aurelia Giacometto." He also describes the agency as, quote, "a shit show." Among the specific concerns Ward listed were bullying and harassment of subordinates, which he said has led to departures of many experienced staff, quote, "extreme micromanagement and compulsive need to control every aspect of the agency," unquote, which Ward said had made staff afraid to undertake even routine tasks for fear of reprimand, hiring unqualified or inexperienced staff to replace the many who have left, and awarding contracts for unclear consulting services to politically connected companies. On that last note, I highly recommend that you read Ward's account of a particular pair of contracts involving the disgraced former mayor of Beaufort, South Carolina, and his wife, the sister of former South Carolina Governor Mark Sanford, who you might remember introduced the phrase hiking the Appalachian Trail as a euphemism into our vernacular. Giacometto dismissed Ward's letter as sour grapes from a disgruntled employee who didn't appreciate the changes she was making to make the agency more efficient and business-friendly. Meanwhile, a survey of LDEQ staff this winter by the state's legislative auditor received responses from a little more than half the total employees. Of those, 78% reported low morale, and more than one-third said they worked in a toxic environment and had experienced or witnessed retaliation from agency leadership. Nearly 14% said they had felt pressured to do something against the law, in violation of department policy, or in violation of state civil service rules. In a response letter, Giacometto dismissed the auditor's findings as containing, quote, "a lot of data, some of which is not particularly useful or relevant to the operations of LDEQ." She also said that what she called the business community had rated her leadership as highly or better than her predecessor. Landry has stood by his appointee throughout the assorted criticisms. Our final stop of the week is in Nashville, where the state legislature recently adjourned for the year. The big-ticket item on Governor Bill Lee's agenda was an expansion of his school voucher program, which he managed to push through the Republican-dominated legislature at the start of its session. That came after the bill had stalled the year before, so it represented a major victory for Lee. We'll be talking more about the expansion of school voucher programs across the South in future episodes. But for today, I want to focus on another education-related bill. Once vouchers had passed, it became the most contested item on the legislative agenda. Pushed by senior party leaders in both the state House and Senate, it would have allowed local school systems across Tennessee to charge tuition to students who couldn't prove they were in the United States legally, and to refuse to enroll them if they couldn't pay. As the bill acknowledged in its own language, it was in direct contradiction of a U.S. Supreme Court precedent. The court's decision in the 1982 case of Plyler v. Doe says that schools must provide free public education to students who live in a district regardless of their immigration status. The bill's sponsors said publicly that they knew it would be challenged in court, and they hoped the Supreme Court's new conservative majority would overturn the 1982 decision. It would have made Tennessee the only state in the country to attempt to deny education to undocumented students. But there was fierce public pushback from a statewide coalition of educators, parents, students, immigrants' rights advocates, and business leaders. Legislative hearings brought passionate and tearful testimony. The bill did end up passing the state Senate on a vote of 19-13, with the opposition including 7 Republicans. One of those was State Senator Todd Gardenhire of Chattanooga, who offered some tearful testimony of his own, beseeching his colleagues to not punish children for any offenses of their parents. "I think this is a bill we do not need and will not pay dividends in the future for the children," he said ahead of the vote. The force of opposition had more effect in the state House, where the bill was hung up in committee as the session wound down. Ultimately, House Majority Leader William Lamberth, the bill's House sponsor, withdrew it from the calendar for the year. He said he wanted to take some time to make sure the bill wouldn't cost the state federal funding. Immigrant advocacy groups and pro-public education organizations celebrated the result. But they will probably need to be ready for a second bout next year. Lamberth has already promised to bring the bill back. That's the news of the week. If you know of issues, situations, scandals, shit shows, or other items of interest that you'd like to bring to our attention, you can write me at jmayshark@theprogressivesouth.org. That email address is also in the show notes. Now let's head out on the road. For our first Headlights visit, I thought it would be interesting both symbolically and substantively to pay a call on Richmond, Virginia. Richmond is the capital of the state, home to the Virginia General Assembly. It was also, for a few years in the 1860s, the capital of the Confederate States of America. The Confederate White House, a neoclassical mansion in the heart of downtown Richmond, where Confederate President Jefferson Davis lived during the war, has been preserved as a historic site and tourist attraction. It is now part of a broader entity called the American Civil War Museum. Richmond remained a hub of white supremacy throughout the Jim Crow era. It was where white conservative state legislators in 1956 adopted a policy called massive resistance to fight against federal efforts to desegregate the South. Even after the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964 and the Voting Rights Act in 1965, the city of Richmond pursued various strategies to ensure continued white rule despite the city's growing African American population. Among other things, the city annexed an adjoining predominantly white county, bolstering its white population, and maintained an at-large voting system to maximize white representation. Lawsuits brought by a civil rights activist named Curtis Holt Sr. ultimately foiled those efforts, and in 1977, for the first time, the city elected a majority-black city council. In the subsequent decades, Richmond has, like most urban centers across the South, trended more and more liberal in its voting patterns. City government is dominated by Democrats, and its voters have voted for the Democratic presidential candidate in every election since 1976. But as we will hear in our upcoming interview, that doesn't automatically translate into a welcoming environment for progressive views and candidates. One of the complex dynamics that plays out in a lot of southern cities is between, on the one hand, Republican legislatures and Democratic cities, and on the other hand, between progressive activists in those cities and the more establishment officials who run them. In Richmond, progressive efforts have found a form and a voice in a grassroots organization called Richmond for All. It's a membership group that anyone can join for monthly dues of $2 to $12, depending on what you can afford. To learn more about them, I dropped by the home of Quentin Robbins, who serves as the group's chair. So, Seth, let's go to the tape. Quentin Robbins is a community organizer in Richmond, Virginia, who serves as chair of a grassroots group called Richmond for All. He grew up in Central Virginia and graduated from Columbia University in 2016 with a degree in economics, mathematics, and computer science. He put that to work running analytics for state-level Democratic campaigns, where he analyzed campaign finance data to improve fundraising outcomes for progressive candidates. He joined Richmond for All in 2019 to aid in the fight against a massive proposed redevelopment project, out of concerns over its diversion of public money to private developers and the likely impact on public schools and local residents, including those in public housing. Richmond for All formed in 2017, initially to support a progressive candidate for the Richmond City School Board. After helping to win that election, the group broadened its focus to include housing and development issues, as well as advocating for more representative local government. It has helped elect 2 more school board candidates, as well as a city council member, and successfully fought off proposals for a new casino in a predominantly black city neighborhood. Richmond for All, I think, is a really interesting model of effective community organizing for progressive causes, and I'm very happy that Quentin has joined us to talk about it. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
First of all, I'd just like to hear a little bit about your background. I'm always interested in how people get engaged in this kind of work. I know you grew up in Virginia. What kind of formed your political awareness and consciousness?
Yeah, so I obviously grew up in Virginia, and as a young gay man living in Virginia, especially in an era where Republicans predominantly controlled city government, I saw a lot of policy come out, including a marriage amendment that, much like DOMA, defined marriage between, quote, a man and a woman. That's, that amendment's still in our Constitution. It's just not enforceable at this precise moment. And I think to start, I think, it felt very radical to me to just be a Democrat, just kind of where I grew up, and sort of the neighborhood that I grew up in. And I did that for many years. I was, very, sort of an Obama follower, if you will. And then I think like a lot of people in 2016, after Trump got elected the first time, I really lost the faith in a really critical way. I think it revealed to me more than just kind of the terror of Donald Trump being the president, the real structural issues inside of the Democratic Party, and became a lot more exposed to the very intentional choices that the Democratic Party had made basically since the 80s to abandon its working class base. There was a couple of years where I felt very lost politically, and found Richmond for All, thankfully, and in particular because I saw them as, I found them as the only group that was opposing this massive development that the mayor at the time, LeVar Stoney, who's now actually running for lieutenant governor, was proposing. And Richmond has a long history of getting caught up in these tricky economic development deals that go bad. And in fact, many of the people in Richmond for All, including myself in that 2016 election for LeVar Stoney, knocked a lot of doors. And I think despite potential points of difference with the mayor that we were very aware of, one thing that felt very important to us as, progressives, people on the left of the Democratic Party coalition, was to steer us away from this obsession with public-private partnerships, the over-reliance on nonprofits to perform essential services, in particular in a way that makes it so it's functionally impossible to coordinate really important functions of government. And LeVar Stoney, the candidate the mayoral candidate who did win at the time, and I remember it very clearly said, no more shiny projects. In particular, because the last mayor had just failed to build a baseball stadium in an area in part of the city called Shockoe Bottom that would have been on a burial ground for formerly enslaved people as a slave jail. He came in and he made these promises about no shiny projects. And then, within the year, he got the call from the CEO of the state energy monopoly and said, me and my friends want this. I'm gonna put my name on it, and they're gonna make a lot of money, so you better get it done. And then, I got involved. We beat it. I caught the bug. I felt electrified, and now I'm here.
Yeah, well, and I want to talk a lot more about Richmond for All, but before we dive more into that, I want to hear a little bit about your thoughts about Richmond itself. I mean, it's the state capital. It's home to Virginia Commonwealth University. On paper, certainly from somebody sitting in Tennessee, it looks pretty liberal. I think I looked back, and it has voted, City Limits Richmond has voted for the Democratic candidate for president every year since 1976. And last year, I think Kamala Harris got like 82% of the vote here. So obviously, it's a very blue city.
I think like many cities in the South, even, a lot of cities in the South, they still vote Democratic. Richmond, obviously, very overwhelmingly a city that will vote consistently for Democratic candidates. Even the internal politics of the city is still very much polarized around racial politics because of the really ugly history in this city.
So, Richmond for All, it's basically a volunteer coalition, right? How does it work? What strikes me about it is that it came together at this point now 8 years ago. And I think one thing I've seen is that it's not that uncommon for sort of a coalition to come together around one election and maybe be successful. Sustaining that through multiple election cycles and then also across multiple issues is a lot of work. How does Richmond for All work? What does it do?
Right. So we really think of ourselves as independent political organization. And for us, what that means is we want to be a political home for progressives who really do feel abandoned by a corporate Democratic Party. You know, we're a member-led, member-governed organization. I think a lot of coalitions end up being very loose, being very hyper-horizontal and unstructured, and are not really planning for a long-term political engagement and sort of a macro level fight, if you will, about who gets to make decisions in our society. We think it should be people. In my opinion, the existing Democratic Party, both on the state and national level, thinks it should be a little bit people, but also a lot of their donors, and in particular corporate donors. And so we, as an organization, really believe that power is built over many years and that you need structure in order to challenge a bigger structure. We don't believe that people live single-issue lives, and so we believe in organizing around a variety of issues and uniting those fights under a common banner, and really believe that a lot of the struggles that we have in our current society for why our lives and living conditions are not what we deserve is because of sort of this common element of corporate control and privatization of government.
So what do you think has been the key to the organization being able to sustain itself, to bring new people in? If somebody somewhere out there is thinking, yes, this is what we need in my city, how do you start that? How do you go about doing it?
Right. So I guess first question first. I think we, unlike I think a lot of organizations on the left, really do believe in structure in an organization. We believe that leadership, much like graphic design or knowing how to knock a door or having a structured organizing conversation, is a skill, and it's not an easy skill, but it's also not an exclusive skill, right? And that learning how to, organize large groups of people, bring people sort of close to sort of your point of view, is a skill, and that you have to cultivate it. A touch point for us is an essay called "The Tyranny of Structurelessness" by Joanne Freeman. A lot of us, having been in various left fights before we joined Richmond for All and created this organization, really felt that tyranny, in that there's sort of this veneer of equality and hyper-horizontalism. But what ends up happening is folks with the most social influence, the most time to dedicate, are actually making the decisions on behalf of everyone in an informal way. And what that necessarily means is that if you don't have sort of the pleasure or the privilege of leisure time to dedicate to organizing efforts, then you don't really have a say in what they do. And so we have, the way that we think about our organization is there's sort of like two levels that provide you no real, actual benefit in terms of like your influence on the organization. But we sort of have our membership, and then we have what are called our volunteer staff. But everyone votes the same. And maybe this year, you had a new kid, a baby, whatever, come into your house. You can't participate. Work got stressful. You have to take on more hours. That doesn't mean you have less say in what happens. And I think that really helps people over a sustained period of time have ownership over this organization. And unlike a lot of nonprofit, more formal organizations, they actually get to have say over who is in leadership in this organization.
So the leaders are elected by the total membership.
Exactly. Yeah. And so we're a member-governed, member-run organization. We do have staff from time to time, but most of the throughput of the work is done by volunteers, or what we call our volunteer staff, and the trajectory of the organization is set every 3 years by our membership. We have a lot of people who are members of the organization who have never elected into that volunteer staff category because it just doesn't fit with their lives, but they still want to, participate in this broader project. I didn't answer your question about how people start this organization. You're always welcome to email us. Again, we're not necessarily experts, but there are a lot of these for all style groups around the South. There's a Memphis for all, a Durham for all, and they operate in a very similar way to us. And, they also have a lot of great resources out there. But I would just start with people you may have engaged with fights in before. And if you feel that you haven't been in a fight with people you trust, that you would want to do something like that, you can usually find them somewhere. And if you can't, just start by yourself, start engaging, start going to your city council meetings, your school board meetings, the mayor's press conferences, and see who's asking the interesting questions, who's there, and just go up to them and say, what are you doing and how can I get involved?
So what is the nature of the work? Let's talk about, for example, the Navy Hill Development Project or the Casino Project. How much of that is raising community awareness, knocking on doors, doing that kind of thing? How much of it is calling, your city council members, or showing up at meetings, or speaking at meetings? Is it public demonstrations? Is it press conferences? Is it all of those things? What does it take to actually have an impact?
I think that the term diversity of tactics is said a lot on the left. We really do believe in that. We do all of those things. I think certain elements of the left feel skeptical about formal electoral politics. We explicitly believe that is a necessary component of a long-term sustainable strategy for the left. So we'll do door knocking, community meetings. We'll also give testimony in front of council. We will have meetings with city council members. But you can't just pressure from the outside, is our opinion. And we very explicitly believe that a problem on the left is that we need to stop being afraid or ashamed of wanting us collectively to have political power. We have to have it, and we have to get it if we want to win in the long run. We're not just going to be able to shame Democrats into doing the right thing. I mean, we're seeing this on the federal level right now. You can't propose the good bill if you don't have somebody to propose it. I think this played out really specifically on the school board. So one of our co-founders and, sort of whose campaign was the origin of our organization, her name's Kenya Gibson. She's now on Richmond City Council, and at that time was running for school board. After the General Assembly in 2021, I believe, authorized collective bargaining for municipal employees, the requirement was that the governing body had to pass, a resolution or an ordinance to affirmatively enable it. Just as an aside, that got watered down. It was supposed to be, every public sector employee universally had collective bargaining rights. The Democratic Party, having a trifecta, watered it down, which is very unfortunate. But while she was on school board and in her second term after the 2020 election, we saw, the school's administration and a lot of the school board members really wanting to slow walk this conversation. I think there were just a lot of fears, based in austerity politics and sort of that corporate Democrat mindset. And, she went out the gate and she proposed it. But she was one person, right? And she couldn't have done it if the teachers union hadn't also had a really incredible organizing program to, ensure that even though, maybe there wasn't like a firm majority of this almost 100% body of doing collective bargaining now, that they were able to create an environment and organize to ensure that this happened.
One thing I'm curious about is that this is obviously a very locally focused organization effort. The issues you're engaging with are about Richmond and the people who live here. There's so much going on at the national level right now that has lots of people riled up, and certainly a lot of people on the left looking for ways to effectively respond. How do you maintain focus in the midst of all that on the local issues as well, and say that we still need to also care about these things and work, in our own backyards, in addition to worrying about what Donald Trump and Elon Musk are doing?
Right. Yeah. I mean, obviously these things are deeply connected. We're a lot of the essential functions of the city are tied to state and federal funding. And so it's not like we're working in a vacuum. I think our sort of theory of change is that it's important to start on the local level, right? I think it's like, the left, we don't really have a bench of candidates. I think if the left is going to be successful, we need to stop running people that appear out of nowhere and posture as progressive, because it's hard to hold them accountable in the long run or really know what they're going to do under pressure. And need to have been doing movement work for a good amount of time before there is that mutual trust that when they get into power that they're actually going to deliver on what they say. I think, we need to sort of like build the bench in that way, right? Get people who have experience, who view being a politician as being an organizer as well. I think for myself, I try to understand or try to remind myself of, what I think I can have some influence on, what I think I can have control, what I think I have the skill to affect. Obviously, there's going to be a very reasonable sense of despair in this moment. I don't think it helps us to hyperfixate on that. And I think, something that's true about the Democratic Party, it's very staff consultant driven. And so that necessarily does not include activating people on the grassroots, right? I think the Democratic Party has really just turned away from grassroots efforts in general. And there are a lot of good people who participate in particular in local committees who want to do that, and they don't really give them any resources. So I think it's very natural that we're in this moment where a lot of people who, self-identify as Democrats or people left, much farther left of that, feel despair. I think I was saying this the other day, like I really feel a great privilege being around a large group of people who are doing stuff. It makes me feel good, right? And it also helps keep that at bay. And then just in terms of personal strategy, what I've been doing is weeding out my social media feeds. And I think the only way we can get out of that despair too is to pick fights that we know we can win and then win them, because that creates hope, and that makes the broader left bigger and more powerful and more hopeful, and we just have to keep doing that over and over again.
So what's ahead? What's next? What's on your agenda for 2025?
Yeah, so I think in Richmond, right as the new mayor was sworn in, our water system failed. And there has been historic neglect in our infrastructure in general. That includes, schools, roads, the gas system, which, by the way, some great folks from the Sierra Club have done testing, and there is truly an insane amount of gas leaking out of this city every single day. A lot of the political capital, political attention by at least the last two mayors has really been on, this pro-growth coalition development that is just hyper-fixated on, expanding the real estate tax base at all costs, regardless of whether that encourages gentrification, and not the basic functions of government that help people believe that government can make their lives better. I think a lot of our focus for the next 4 years is going to be on demanding from leaders that they turn their attention back to the essentials, which is, infrastructure, social services, things like that.
All right. Well, I think that's a good place to wrap it up. So Quentin Robbins with Richmond for All, thanks so much for talking with us. And we will have links in the show notes to the organization and to articles about some of the issues that you've been talking about. Thanks again.
So much.
As I mentioned earlier, Rhiannon Giddens organized and hosted a festival the last weekend in April. It was called Biscuits and Banjos, and it was dedicated to the reclamation and exploration of Black music, art, and culture in Giddens' home state of North Carolina. Over the course of 3 days in Durham, the festival featured dozens of musical performances by artists including jazz bassist Christian McBride, blues singer Taj Mahal, guitarist Yasmin Williams, and Giddens herself in a long-awaited reunion of the Carolina Chocolate Drops. That band formed as a trio in 2005 with Giddens, Dom Flemons, and Justin Robinson. They met at the first Black Banjo Gathering in Boone, North Carolina, a town in the Blue Ridge Mountains. They helped recover and popularize the history of black string band music in the 19th and early 20th centuries. I was not lucky enough to attend the festival, but it was sold out and by all accounts a huge success. In the show notes, you can find a link to some great photographs from the weekend. Alongside the music, the festival featured presentations and panel discussions on cultural topics including Black voices in country music, sounds, soul, and supper, and libraries as sanctuaries for Black stories. And yes, there were biscuits, as well as a discussion of the art of the biscuit. The program was in line with Giddens' whole career, which has combined a scholarly knowledge of Black Southern music and culture with an expansive sense of its possibilities. And, of course, her own great talents as a singer, musician, and composer. Beginning with the Carolina Chocolate Drops and continuing through a solo career and projects like the ballet Black Lucy and the Bard, Giddens has worked in an array of musical forms and traditions, but she has always come back to her North Carolina roots. She is currently touring with her new band, the Old Time Review, and she is promising to bring Biscuits and Banjos back in 2 years, so start making plans for 2027. That wraps us up for this episode. One thing that strikes me about the stories we heard this week is that several of them demonstrate the ways that people really can have an impact, even in settings that may seem politically and culturally hostile. Richmond for All obviously illustrates the power and possibility of well-organized grassroots action. The statewide coalition that came together in Tennessee to fight for undocumented students shows that moral arguments can carry a lot of force, even in these conservative supermajority states. And the Arkansas families who stood up for their children's rights showed that constitutional rights really are available to us if we're willing to assert them. All right, just a reminder that you can find more information at our website, theprogressivesouth.org. The Progressive South is a nonprofit, and we appreciate any and all support. You can find donation information on the website. Our theme music is by Bark. Production is by Lord Seth the Libertarian at Barbarian Productions. If you want to chime in and say hi, we have a number you can call, 865-214-7764. That's 865-214-PROG. Leave us a message. Tell us where you're calling from and a little bit about what's going on where you are. Next week, we head to Nashville to talk with a longtime labor leader about workers' rights in a right-to-work state.